Hollywood sells you a myth, the lone hero, a heavy machine gun, a symbol of raw power. The reality is different. For the man behind the gun, the story wasn't heroic. It was a death sentence. So who really paid for this firepower? Ordinary guys turned into cannon fodder. The weapon is the Browning .50 caliber, designed in 1918, still in use. During World War II alone, American factories built 2 million of them. That was one heavy machine gun for every 7 American soldiers. But this isn't a story about a weapon. It's about the men trapped behind it, and their story is the one that's never told. This grim reality began in the sky. Inside bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, American doctrine was built on a simple idea. Fly so high, anti-aircraft guns can't reach you. Let your defensive armament handle any fighter that tries to intercept. But the theory was a fatal miscalculation. Enemy fighters could absolutely reach those altitudes. They came in relentless waves. The Flying Fortress wasn't a fortress. It was a slow, heavy magnet for attack. So the bombers bristled with guns. A B-17G model carried 13 M2 machine guns. Think of the noise. The deafening, percussive roar of 13 heavy machine guns shaking a thin aluminum fuselage. The crew was 10 men. The majority were not pilots. They were gunners. Bait, whose only job was to fight back. German fighter pilots soon learned to hunt the gunners first. The roots of that slaughter didn't start in the sky. They started in an office. July 1917. General John Pershing watched his men's bullets bounce off German armor. Useless. He was desperate. So he made a demand. A new weapon. A new caliber. Why did the infantry need something so insane? Because their standard rounds were doing nothing. John Browning answered the call. He designed a new cartridge from scratch, the 12.7 by 99 millimeter, the .50 BMG. The ballistics of that round were so perfect, they're still the foundation for modern sniper rifles. But the weapon built for it was a disaster. The first prototype was tested on October 15, 1918. Too late. The war was almost over. The gun weighed 121 pounds, a monster of steel. Impractical, unreliable. For nearly a decade, it was a failure collecting dust. The project stalled, a dead end. And John Browning, the weapon's creator, died before he could fix it. With Browning gone, the project nearly died. But between 1927 and 1932, engineers at Colt found a solution. Their answer to the overheating was brute force, a heavy barrel. The new version was designated the M2HB, 84 pounds of solid steel. It could fire long bursts without melting down, leaving only the sharp smell of scorched metal in the air. This was no longer a rifle. This was a monster. It spit 450 to 575 rounds per minute. Each bullet left the barrel with 10 to 15,000 foot-pounds of energy. A gut punch of pure kinetic force. To understand that number, look at the other guns of the era. A submachine gun delivered maybe 500 foot-pounds. This was 20, sometimes 30 times more powerful. It was designed not to wound. It was designed to obliterate. Then, World War II began. This wasn't the ground gun anymore. This was the AN/M2, the 61-pound airborne model, with a shorter 36-inch barrel and a terrifying rate of fire. 750 rounds a minute, 850. Some were tuned up to 1,200. That's 20 bullets tearing through the air every single second. But it was never enough. A German fighter screams past the open window. A blur of steel and black crosses. You have 2 seconds, maybe 3. You slam the triggers. A torrent of hot brass casings clatters across the aluminum floor. The freezing slipstream howls through the fuselage, ripping heat from the barrel. The enemy knew this. German pilots learned fast. To kill a bomber, you kill its gunners first. The waist gunner positions became the bullseye. 2 open windows on the side of the aircraft. They absorbed 20% of all hits. The men standing there paid the price. 20% killed, another 20% wounded. It was the highest casualty rate of any crew position on the bomber. But for one man on the B-17, the greatest threat wasn't enemy fire, it was his job. He was the ball turret gunner. A human sacrifice packed into a plexiglass sphere, the Sperry ball turret. Just 44 inches across, only men 5 feet 4 inches or shorter could even apply. You didn't sit, you curled. Knees to your chest in a fetal position inside a space smaller than a washing machine, with 2 heavy machine guns for company. What was scarier than enemy flak? Getting stuck inside the sphere with a jammed hatch. The turret was a trap. You couldn't wear a parachute in there, not enough room. To bail out, you had to follow a procedure. First, rotate the turret to face the sky. Second, open the hatch and climb into the damaged, smoke-filled fuselage. Third, find your parachute. Then, you could jump. If the power failed, you could crank it by hand. Slowly, agonizingly. But if the gears were hit, if the mechanism was jammed, you were trapped. A prisoner under a dying plane. And if the B-17 had to belly land, the turret was the first thing to hit the runway. The only sound was the shriek of plexiglass scraping against concrete. A sound you would only hear once. There were stories. Aircraft commanders, barely 22 years old, facing an impossible choice. The landing gear was gone. The gunner was trapped. The commander made the decision. He would land the plane, knowing his gunner was about to be crushed. Even for the men who weren't trapped, survival was a different kind of hell. At 35,000 feet, a new enemy was waiting. It was minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, in a completely unpressurized aircraft with open gun positions. The wind blast was a physical weapon. By 1944, it caused over half of all frostbite cases. Imagine a gun jams. The gunner rips his glove off, a desperate move. His bare skin touches the frozen metal of the machine gun. It freezes solid, instantly. He pulls his hand away, the skin rips off, leaving flesh and blood frozen to the steel. Between 1943 and 1944, the cold killed more airmen than the Germans did. It broke their minds long before it broke their bodies. One gunner said it best, "You got so cold, so miserable, you just didn't care if you made it back. You just wanted it to be over." The casualty figures for the 8th Air Force were brutal. Over 12% were killed in action, a death rate higher than the U.S. Marines fighting in the bloodiest battles of the Pacific. A tour of duty was 25 missions, but only about 1/3 of the crews ever made it that far. Survival in the sky was a lottery. On the ground, it was a death sentence. By 1945, the M2 gunner had become the #1 target on the battlefield. Why was his life so short? Because of the weapon in his hands. The .50 BMG wasn't just another machine gun. It was a category of its own. Brick walls didn't stop it. Concrete didn't stop it. A single round could punch clean through. A sustained burst would bring the whole wall down. Any cover that worked against rifles was now useless. Even German tanks weren't safe. The Panzer IV had 80 millimeters of frontal armor, but its sides were less than 30 millimeters thick. A death trap. The .50 caliber rounds tore through their optics, shredded their tracks, and punched straight through the weaker side armor. The weapon was everywhere. Millions of M2s had been produced, mounted on nearly every American Jeep and tank. There's a myth that the Geneva Convention banned the .50 BMG. It's not true, but the stories about its effects were not exaggerated. A single hit meant a lost limb, or it meant you didn't survive, period. German soldiers saw this firsthand. They learned fast. They stopped charging the guns directly. Instead, they began hunting the gunners with snipers, mortars, and dedicated artillery fire. Being a target in Europe was one thing. In Vietnam, the gunners found a new kind of hell. One made of water, jungle, and no room to run. During the worst fighting, the math was simple. 6% of riverboat crews were killed or wounded, every single month. Over a 1-year tour, 3 out of 4 sailors could expect to get hit. The place was the Mekong Delta, a claustrophobic maze of brown water and thick green walls. The crews rowed fiberglass patrol boats with twin M2s up front and another in the back. But the enemy wasn't a distant shape. They were close enough to see. An ambush starts with a flash from the tree line. Splinters of the boat's hull fly through the air. The gunner blindly swings his barrels toward the attack, unleashing a wall of lead. The air fills with the sharp smell of gunpowder and the thick, rotting stench of swamp water. Ambushes happened at 100 yards or less, the length of a football field. There is no time to dodge a rocket at that range. River Division 531 lost 7 of its 10 boats in just 40 days. The gunners were the first to die, and the first to shoot back. For their sacrifice, these sailors became the most decorated naval unit of the war. 2 Medals of Honor and 14 Navy Crosses. But this lethal exposure wasn't confined to the water. The problem started earlier. On the Sherman tanks of World War II, American .50 caliber firepower had reached its extreme. The M45 quad mount, a monster. 4 M2 machine guns bolted to a single electric turret. It spat out 2,000 rounds a minute. German soldiers called it the meat chopper. The weapon was designed to shred low-flying aircraft. But by 1944, the skies belonged to the Allies. So the gunners turned them on the ground. They didn't just hit snipers, they cut down the entire trees they were hiding in. But for the gunner on a standard Sherman tank, the reality was different. He had one M2, mounted behind the turret. To use it, a crewman had to climb out, stand on the hot, slick metal of the engine deck, completely exposed. So why get out of the tank? Why stand up in the middle of a firefight? Because the gun was mounted to shoot at planes. There was no way to fire it from inside the vehicle. This brutal vulnerability, standing open on the armor, would soon set the stage for the most desperate act of 1945. After all, Army manuals noted a cold logic. It was far cheaper to spray a suspicious bush with the .50 cal than to waste a main gun round. That brutal logic of exposure had a human price. A price paid in full on January 26, 1945. One man on a burning machine against 200 German infantry and 6 tank destroyers. Lieutenant Audie Murphy's company was breaking, outgunned, overwhelmed. He ordered his men to fall back. Then he saw it. A friendly M10 tank destroyer, hit and abandoned. It was on fire. Flames licked out from under the armor. The air shimmered with heat. He climbed onto the burning hull. His boots were on metal scorching over fuel and ammunition. Murphy grabbed the handles of the M2. He aimed. He opened fire. For 1 hour, he stood alone, pouring lead into attackers from 3 sides. He stopped a squad crawling up a ditch. He held the line. 50 casualties inflicted in an hour. That's nearly 1 man killed every single minute. He physically stopped an entire company's advance. The gun fell silent, ammunition spent. He had a wound in his leg. Murphy climbed down from the burning wreck. Then he led his men in a counterattack. One man's courage could save a platoon. But a few years later, in Korea, the fight was different. This wasn't about saving a few men. It was about holding back an ocean. The enemy came in waves, human waves. How do you stop 1,000 men running straight at you? You don't aim, you just fire. And you don't stop. The firing was constant, unbroken. The heavy steel barrels of the M2s glowed cherry red. Then they began to sag under their own heat. The metal itself was failing. Between attacks, soldiers poured canteens of freezing water over the guns. The sound was a furious hiss of steam and desperation. Anything to keep shooting. At the Chosin Reservoir, Marines fired until the weapons simply fell apart. They called it cutting down wheat with a sickle. A wall of lead against a wall of bodies. But a single machine gun wasn't enough. The rate of fire was too slow. The solution was the M45 quad mount. It took 4 barrels, firing together, just to stand a chance. The same desperation that melted barrels in Korea forced men to weld their own armor in Vietnam. Route 19, near Pleiku. An ambush strikes a convoy, 30 trucks gone, in just 10 minutes. That's a new vehicle destroyed every 20 seconds. The drivers were kids, 18, 19 years old. They understood the math. No one was coming to protect them. So they built their own protection. They dragged rusted steel sheets across motor pools. Sparks flew from makeshift welding rigs in the dead of night. They bolted heavy M2s directly into the beds of their trucks. You could hear them coming from a mile away. The constant groan and bang of crudely welded armor on rough dirt roads. They built a new class of vehicle, the gun truck. They scavenged scrapyards for anything that could shoot. Sometimes they found relics, old M45 quad mounts from World War II left to rust. They dragged them out and welded them on. By 1969, over 100 of these Frankenstein monsters were rolling. They were a phantom fleet. Not a single one of these trucks was ever officially authorized by the Army. But in Vietnam, improvisation wasn't just about survival. It was about lethality. How do you hit a target from over 2 kilometers away? For the Marines, the answer was brutal. You bolt a sniper scope onto a heavy machine gun. Operation Dado, 1967. Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock is on a hilltop. He has an M2 on its tripod. Navy techs had welded a custom bracket to the heavy barrel. A sharp metallic click as he attaches an 8-power inertial scope. He zeroes the weapon and waits. A target appears. A Viet Cong fighter pushing a bicycle loaded with weapons. Hathcock called him the Hamburger. The distance, 2,500 yards. He fires a single shot. At that range, the bullet travels for seconds. The target is dead long before the sound of the shot ever arrives. That record stood for 35 years. It was proof. The 50 cal could be a surgeon's scalpel, not just a sledgehammer. The shot directly inspired a young gunsmith, Ronnie Barrett. In 1982, he designed the world's first practical 50 caliber sniper rifle. But the M2's incredible power made its operator a priority target, a piece of meat behind the metal. By the end of the war, standardized gun shields for vehicle-mounted 50s were still not standard issue. The general's failure to provide protection wasn't an oversight. It was a policy, and it was paid for in blood by men like Sergeant Paul Ray Smith. Before deploying to Iraq, Smith wrote a letter to his parents. There are 2 ways to come home: stepping off the plane and being carried off the plane. It doesn't matter how I come home because I am prepared to give all that I am. On April 4, 2003, near Baghdad's airport, he paid that price. His unit was ambushed. The crew of an M113 armored carrier was hit. Smith climbed on top, manned the 50 caliber. He stood completely exposed as enemy fire came from 3 directions. He just kept shooting. His fire stopped the enemy from overrunning an aid station. More than 100 wounded soldiers were inside. Smith was killed by a round to the head, still on the gun. The turrets of the M113 and the Humvee became the kill zones of Iraq. Gunners had the highest casualty rates in convoy attacks. They were the first to die. Private Ross McGinnis was 19 years old. On December 4, 2006, his Humvee was patrolling Adamiyah, Baghdad. An insurgent on a rooftop threw a grenade. It fell through the gunner's hatch. A dull thud on the hot metal floor, right between 4 soldiers. McGinnis screamed the warning, "Grenade!" Procedure was to yell and jump. Save yourself. He didn't jump. He threw himself onto it, absorbing the entire blast with his body. The other 4 men survived without a single scratch. The sacrifices of men like Smith and McGinnis were not accidents. They were a system. Across Iraq and Afghanistan, the Humvee gunner became target number 1. He controlled the convoy's most powerful weapon, a 50 caliber machine gun that could shred concrete. But the man behind that gun had nothing. No armor, no shield, just open air. A perfect silhouette. Insurgent tactics were built around this single, fatal weakness. Grenades dropped from rooftops, landing in the open hatch. Snipers picking off the only visible figure. RPGs aimed directly at the turret ring. The vehicle itself was a trap. Early model Humvees were built with thin aluminum bodies. A standard round from an AK-47 would tear right through. The inside became a shredder of hot metal. For the soldiers inside, it was a nightmare. For the gunner, it was a certainty. Then came the IEDs, the signature weapon of the war, buried, waiting. When a Humvee hit one, the chassis might absorb some of the blast, but the gunner was standing directly above it. He was guaranteed to take the full upward charge of shrapnel. The solution wasn't to add more steel, it was to get the man out of the turret. Completely. In late 2004, the Army deployed its answer. CROWS, the Common Remotely Operated Weapons Station. How long does it take to protect the man behind the gun? The Army needed almost a century. The open hatch was sealed, the wind and dust were gone. Now there was only the dark interior of an armored vehicle. The gunner sat inside, safe, staring at a screen, a soft green glow on his face, his hand on a joystick guiding a crosshair over a thermal image. He presses a button. Outside, the M2 fires. By 2013, the Army had installed over 8,000 of these systems. That meant 8,000 soldiers were no longer living targets on a roof. They were hidden behind thick armor. The system was brutally effective. Day and night cameras, a laser rangefinder, a computer that calculated the shot. Over 95% accuracy, even against moving targets. The same weapon John Browning designed in 1918, now fired from a safe room. The 324th M2 ever made was finally retired in 2015. It served for 94 years. 100 years. That's how long it took to pull the gunner to safety.